My brother left me and my two kids stranded at an airport 4,000 miles from home. He took our passports, our cash, and the deed to my late grandmother's house, then smiled and said the house would be his by the time we made it back. He believed stealing those documents would be enough to force my hand. He had no idea I'd spent the last 6 months preparing in case he ever tried something like this. Mom, where did Uncle Dorian go? My daughter, Wilder, was 9. He kept scanning the terminal like he might just be standing behind a pillar somewhere, playing some kind of joke. My son Finch was 6. He didn't ask anything. He just gripped the strap of his backpack and watched my face, the way children do when they sense something is wrong before a single word gets said out loud. I told them their uncle had gone to find a restroom. That was a lie. I already knew, standing in that terminal with my heart slamming against my ribs, that Dorian wasn't coming back. He'd finally done what he'd been threatening to do for half a year. He hadn't flown us to Ireland to see our family's old cottage one last time before it sold. He'd flown us there to get rid of us long enough to take something that was never his to take. Let me back up. My name is Briar. I'm 34 years old and I work as a forensic auditor for a regional accounting firm, a detail that is going to matter a great deal later in this story. I was widowed 3 years ago, and since then it had been just me, Wilder, and Finch, 2 jobs, a mortgage, and a determination that nothing else would ever be taken from us without a fight. My grandmother, Eleanor, was the person who raised me during the summers my own parents were too busy to. She taught me how to balance a checkbook before I could ride a bike without training wheels. She taught me that paperwork wasn't boring, it was protection, and that the people who kept careful records were rarely the ones left holding nothing. When she passed away last year, she left her house, the same house I'd spent every June and July of my childhood in, entirely to me. Not to my parents. Not to my brother Dorian. To me, specifically by name, in a will she'd updated herself less than a year before she died. Dorian did not take this well. He'd spent the last decade building a life that looked successful from the outside and was quietly falling apart underneath it. A car payment he could barely cover. A downtown apartment he was 3 months behind on. A girlfriend, Sable, who believed he came from real money because he'd simply never corrected her. When the will was read, Dorian didn't cry. He laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh, and said, "She barely visited that house in 10 years. This has to be a mistake." It wasn't a mistake. My grandmother had told me herself, the spring before she passed, exactly why she was leaving it to me. "You're the only one who ever showed up for this house without wanting something from it," she said, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of tea going cold beside her. "The rest of them only remember it exists when they think it's worth something." I remember one summer, I couldn't have been older than 11, when Dorian came to visit for exactly 3 days and spent most of it asking Grandma how much the property was worth. She laughed it off at the time, told him a house wasn't a number, it was a place that held people. He rolled his eyes and went back to his video game. I never forgot that conversation even as a kid. Some patterns start early, long before anyone bothers to name them out loud. My husband, Callahan, passed away 3 years ago in a car accident on a rainy November night, on his way home from work. Losing him meant losing our second income overnight, and it meant Wilder and Finch losing their father before Finch was old enough to really hold on to memories of him. It also meant I stopped having anyone to talk things through with at the end of a long day, which is part of why Grandma's steady, practical voice mattered as much as it did, even after she was gone. She was the closest thing to a partner I had left in difficult decisions. My parents sided with Dorian almost immediately. My mother called me twice a week for a month, telling me Grandma wasn't in her right mind near the end, that it would be the right thing to sign the house over for the sake of the family. My father said Dorian had real plans for the property, plans that would supposedly help everyone. I knew exactly what those plans were. Sell the house. Pay off his debts. Fund the version of himself he'd been performing for Sable. I refused to sign anything and I hired a lawyer to make sure the will was airtight in case anyone got creative. That should have been the end of it. Instead, 3 weeks ago Dorian called with an idea. Our grandmother's cottage in Ireland, the one she'd inherited from her own mother decades earlier, was finally being sold by the estate managing it overseas. Dorian said it would mean everything if the family could see it one last time before it changed hands forever. He offered to book the flights. He offered to cover the hotel. He even offered to carry our folder of documents, our passports, my wallet, and the deed to Grandma's house here at home, since I'd need it for a brief meeting with a local solicitor about some minor cross-border paperwork. "You look exhausted," he told me 2 days before we left the country. "Let me carry the folder. You've got enough on your plate with the kids." I should have said no. But I was tired, genuinely tired, the kind of tired that comes from raising 2 children alone while defending an inheritance from your own family, and some quiet, hopeful part of me wanted to believe my brother had actually changed. That this trip really was about closure. About family the way he kept insisting. I handed him the folder. That was the last mistake I let him talk me into. The night before we left, Wilder asked me if Uncle Dorian was actually excited about the trip, or if he was just being nice because grown-ups were arguing about the house again. Kids notice more than we give them credit for. I told her he was probably just excited to see where Grandma grew up, the same lie I'd been telling myself all week. Finch asked if the cottage had a yard. I told him it had a garden instead, which felt close enough to true to say out loud. We landed in Dublin on a grey, drizzling Tuesday morning. The first 2 days were quiet, almost peaceful. We toured the cottage together. Wilder cried a little, running her hand along the same wooden banister our grandmother used to slide her palm across every morning. Finch found an old tin of buttons in a drawer and carried it around like treasure. Dorian was strangely cheerful the entire visit, almost performing warmth, which I told myself was nerves about the upcoming sale. I noticed him take a few phone calls outside, low-voiced, stepping just far enough away that I couldn't hear the words. I told myself it was business. I wanted to believe that so badly that I didn't ask. On our final morning, waiting at the gate for our flight home, Dorian crouched down in front of my children with a smile I'd seen 1,000 times growing up, the one he always used right before he wanted something from someone. "Who wants pastries before the flight?" he asked them. Both kids lit up immediately. "I'll take them," he said. "You stay here and rest. You've been running on empty this entire trip." I handed him the document folder without thinking twice, the same folder he'd carried through security both ways, while I knelt down to retie Finch's loose shoelace. When I looked up less than a minute later, my children were standing beside me. Dorian was gone. So was the folder. Our passports. My wallet. The deed to Grandma's house. My phone showed 6% battery remaining. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the screen and call him. He picked up on the second ring. I could hear gate announcements behind him, a flight number I didn't recognize. "Dorian, where are you?" He laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A satisfied one. "Somewhere you can't follow, Briar." My daughter started crying quietly beside me. My son pressed his face into my side without saying a word. Dorian's voice dropped, gentle and almost reasonable, the exact tone he always used right before saying something cruel. "By the time you find your way home, the house will already be handled. You should have just signed it over when Mom asked you to. Dorian, we have no passports. We have no money. We are in a foreign country with 2 children. Then I guess you'll figure it out," he said. "You're good at figuring things out. Isn't that your whole job?" The call ended. For a long moment I couldn't move. Travelers rushed past us in every direction, suitcases rattling across the tile. Announcements layered over one another in languages I only half understood. My son's hand found mine. My daughter wiped her face with her sleeve, trying so hard to be brave, the way children do when they think being strong will fix things for the adults around them. I looked down at both of them and something in me went very calm. Not because I wasn't afraid. I was terrified. But because I finally understood with total clarity exactly what kind of fight I was in. And unlike my brother, I actually knew how to win it. Here is what Dorian didn't know about me. 6 months earlier, when he first started making comments about handling things his own way regarding Grandma's house, I hadn't just hired a lawyer. As a forensic auditor, I know better than almost anyone how easily paperwork disappears, how quietly documents get misplaced or corrected the moment real money is involved. So I'd taken precautions that had nothing to do with paranoia and everything to do with experience. I had scanned every page of the deed and stored it in 3 separate places. my lawyer's office, a secured cloud folder, and a locked box at my own bank. I had also placed a protective flag on the property's title through the county recorder's office, the exact kind of flag that gets triggered automatically the moment anyone attempts to file a new deed, a lien, or a sale on that property without my direct, notarized authorization present. Dorian thought stealing a folder of paper would erase my ownership of that house. It wouldn't. Not for a second. But I still had 2 children standing in a foreign airport with no passports, no money, and a mother whose phone was about to die completely. I walked straight to the nearest airline desk. An employee in a Navy uniform took one look at my face and came around the counter immediately. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I looked at my children. Then at the security camera mounted above the gate, quietly grateful that Irish airports are covered in them from nearly every angle. "No," I said, steadier than I felt. "My brother just left with our passports and our travel documents. I need airport security, and I need to reach the American embassy right away." Within 20 minutes I was sitting with a security officer, describing Dorian in careful detail. His height, his likely departure that same morning, the direction he'd walked with my children's breakfast money still in his pocket. I gave them his full legal name. I gave them the flight number I'd overheard echoing behind him on the call. Within the hour I was on the phone with the U.S. Embassy in Dublin, explaining the situation to a consular officer named Ms. Halloway, whose calm, practiced voice told me she'd handled far messier situations than mine. "We can issue emergency passports for you and the children," she told me. "It typically takes 24 to 48 hours once we've verified your identities." Verifying our identities without a single document on hand should have been the hardest part of that entire day. It wasn't, because 6 months of quiet preparation meant I had digital copies of our passports, our birth certificates, and my driver's license saved in that same secure cloud folder, accessible from any device, anywhere in the world at any hour. I had built a paper trail specifically because I never fully trusted my own brother. That instinct just saved my children. While we waited in Dublin for emergency travel documents, airport security pulled footage from the terminal cameras. It showed Dorian walking away from us at an unhurried pace, folder tucked under one arm, before boarding a flight to Boston 40 minutes later under his own full name, without a single attempt to disguise what he'd done. He hadn't planned an escape. He'd planned a head start. That told me everything about how confident he was that I wouldn't manage to do anything meaningful before he reached our grandmother's house on the other side of the ocean. He was wrong. The moment I had a working phone with a full charge, I called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Larkin who had handled the original will dispute from the very beginning. I explained everything: the stolen folder, the deed, Dorian's flight home, the words he'd said on the phone. "He can't legally transfer, sell, or file anything on that property," she told me flatly. "The protective flag we placed months ago means any attempt to record a new deed gets automatically frozen pending verification. Physically holding a piece of paper does not give him ownership. It never did, and it never will." So I asked her to do one more thing. I asked her to notify the county recorder's office directly in writing that the deed had been stolen, and to formally request that any attempt to use it be treated as a criminal matter rather than a family disagreement. She filed the request within the hour, while I sat on an uncomfortable airport bench with my son asleep against my shoulder and my daughter finally starting to breathe normally again. 2 days later, once our emergency passports were approved, we flew home. I spent both flights holding my children a little tighter than usual, watching Wilder slowly relax somewhere over the Atlantic, watching Finch fall asleep still clutching that same dinosaur backpack like it was the only stable thing left in his world. When we landed, I didn't go home first. I went straight to my lawyer's office. Dorian, as it turned out, had spent his head start exactly the way I expected he would. He'd gone directly to a title company near our grandmother's house, deed in hand, attempting to open a sale listing using paperwork he did not legally possess and a signature that was never his to give. The title company ran a standard ownership verification, as they always do on any transaction of that size, and immediately hit the protective flag my lawyer had placed months earlier. The transaction was frozen on the spot. The title officer, following standard procedure for a flagged file, contacted the county recorder, who confirmed the property carried an active theft report, filed by the rightful legal owner just 2 days prior. Dorian was asked, politely but firmly, to leave the building. He tried 2 more places that same week. A second title company turned him away within minutes once his name came up flagged in their system. A private buyer he knew through Sable's social circle, someone apparently willing to skip a few formalities for a discount, backed out entirely once his own attorney reviewed the paperwork and noticed the deed's notarization date didn't match any record on file. Word travels fast in small professional circles, and by the 3rd failed attempt, people had started quietly asking why a man was trying to sell a house using documents that weren't legitimately his. One of the title officers later told my lawyer, off the record, that Dorian had grown visibly agitated during that final meeting, insisting there had been a misunderstanding within the family, and that the sale needed to close quickly for reasons he never fully explained. The officer said it was the urgency more than anything else that made the whole situation feel wrong before the system flag even confirmed it. Sable found out not from Dorian himself, but from a mutual acquaintance who'd heard about the failed sale attempts through a friend at the second title company. When she confronted him directly, he apparently admitted everything all at once: the debts, the stolen folder, the family he'd abandoned at a foreign airport with nothing but a 6-year-old's dinosaur backpack between them, and disaster. She packed her things and left within the week, taking with her the last piece of the image Dorian had spent years carefully building. Meanwhile, I filed a formal police report detailing the abandonment at the airport and the theft of our documents, supported by the terminal security footage, the embassy correspondence, and my lawyer's full paper trail. Local detectives coordinated with Irish airport authorities to corroborate the entire timeline down to the minute. Because Dorian had used his own name, his own passport, and his own flight booking throughout, there was no meaningful question left about who was responsible. He hadn't been hiding. He'd never thought he'd need to. He'd been that certain I wouldn't fight back. 3 weeks after we landed, my lawyer called with an update. Local detectives had gone to Dorian's apartment 2 days earlier. According to the report Larkin shared with me, he answered the door already halfway through packing a suitcase, as though some part of him had known this moment was coming since the title company turned him away the 3rd time. He was formally charged in connection with the theft of personal documents and an attempted fraudulent property transfer, the exact language Larkin used when she read me the case number over the phone. My parents, who had spent the better part of a year telling me to simply hand the house over for the sake of family peace, went quiet for the first time since the will was originally read. My Aunt Rosalind, my mother's sister, called me the following week. She'd heard a partial version of the story through family group chats and wanted to hear the rest directly from me. When I told her everything, the folder, the airport, the phone call, she went silent for a long moment before saying, "I always wondered what your grandmother saw that the rest of us didn't. I think I understand it now." It was the first time anyone on that side of the family had said something that actually felt like support instead of pressure. She offered to speak with my parents directly, and whether or not it changed anything for them, it mattered to me that someone finally chose to ask questions instead of assigning blame. My mother called once, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "I didn't know he'd actually leave you at an airport," she said. "I thought he just meant the paperwork." "You knew he wanted to take something that was never his," I told her. "The method was always going to match the intention behind it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My father never called at all. A few months later, at a hearing I attended with Larkin by my side, Dorian was ordered to pay full restitution covering the cost of our emergency travel documents, the embassy fees, and the legal expenses tied to the fraudulent transfer attempts, along with additional court-ordered conditions related to the property theft charge. The judge specifically noted, reading from the report, that the incident involved 2 minor children left without documentation or funds in a foreign country, a detail that visibly shifted the tone of the entire hearing. Dorian sat 2 rows ahead of me the entire time and never once turned around. When the judge asked if he had anything to say for himself, he simply said, "No, Your Honor," in a flat voice I barely recognized as his. There was no apology. Not that day and not since. A few weeks after the hearing, I drove out to the house with the kids on a Saturday morning, just to walk through it the way we used to when Grandma was still alive. Wilder ran straight to the garden and started naming the flowers she remembered, half of them wrong. All of them said with so much confidence I didn't correct her. Finch found a spot on the back porch and just sat there for a while. Quiet in the way kids get when a place feels important even if they can't explain why. I sat down next to him and thought about how close we'd come to losing all of it over a folder of paper and one afternoon of misplaced trust. Then I thought about every quiet, unremarkable choice I'd made in the 6 months before that trip. The scans, the notarized copies, the flag on the title, decisions that felt almost excessive at the time. None of them had felt dramatic while I was making them. They'd felt like ordinary caution. It turns out ordinary caution is sometimes the only thing standing between a family and losing everything. The house is still mine. It will remain mine, fully documented, fully protected, exactly the way my grandmother intended it to be. Dorian is facing the legal consequences of a plan he built entirely on the assumption that stealing a folder from a forensic auditor was a winning strategy. There was no remorse from him, no attempt to make things right with the children he left crying in a terminal on the other side of the world. Some people only understand consequences once they've already lost everything that mattered to them, and even then some of them still don't understand it at all. My children are safe. Wilder still talks about the cottage sometimes, the good parts, the wooden banister, the garden our grandmother used to keep. Finch still carries that same dinosaur backpack, though these days it's less a security blanket and more just a backpack he happens to like the look of. What stays with me most isn't the anger. It's the reminder of something I already knew from years of untangling other people's financial messes for a living. The people most confident they'll get away with something are usually the ones who never bothered to check whether someone smarter had already closed every door behind them, long before they ever tried to walk through one. My brother thought a folder full of paper could take a house away from me. He never once considered that I'd already made sure paper was the least powerful thing in that entire fight. I think about that airport terminal often, the fluorescent lights, the announcements in a language I couldn't fully follow, my daughter's hand gripping mine so tightly it left marks. I think about how close that moment came to defining us as victims instead of survivors. The difference in the end wasn't luck. It was preparation made quietly months in advance, by someone who'd learned the hard way that family doesn't automatically mean safety, and that love without boundaries is just an open door for anyone determined enough to walk through it. I don't regret trusting Dorian with that folder as much as I thought I would. I regret trusting him without also protecting myself in case that trust turned out to be misplaced. Those are two very different lessons, and I only fully understood the difference once we were standing in that terminal with nothing but each other. So here's what I want to ask you. If someone in your own family tried to take something you'd worked and waited your whole life to protect, would you have the paperwork ready before they ever made their move? Or would you find out the hard way exactly how much preparation matters? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story kept you watching until the very end, hit subscribe because Sophie Revenge posts a brand new story just like this one every single day. Justice always finds its way home eventually, and I'll be right here telling you how. I'm Sophie, and I'll see you in the next one.